I don't care what permits you think you have. That thing is a tinderbox waiting to happen, and I am going to have the County Fire Marshal's office shut it down, chain the doors, and fine you into oblivion. Karen's voice, a shrill instrument of pure entitlement, cut through the quiet afternoon air, each word dripping with a venomous certainty that grated on my very soul. She stood on my lawn, a plus-size empress in a beige pantsuit, her clipboard held against her chest like a shield of divine authority, her finger jabbing towards the brand-new workshop I'd spent the last 6 months of my life building with my own two hands. Her face was a mask of smug righteousness, the kind worn by people who have never been told no and believe the world is their personal kingdom to regulate. The threat wasn't just an empty boast, it was a declaration of war aimed at my sanctuary, my retirement dream, and the one place on this earth I had built to be truly mine. She wanted to burn it all down, figuratively, using the very system I now represented. The sheer, unadulterated irony was so thick I could almost taste it. If you've ever had a run-in with an HOA president who thinks they're a feudal lord, smash that subscribe button and let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Share your own nightmare story, because trust me, you are not alone, and you are not going to believe the hornet's nest this woman kicked over when she decided to weaponize my own office against me. The story of how I dismantled her little empire of petty tyranny started right there, on my perfectly manicured, HOA-compliant front lawn, with a threat that would ultimately become the architect of her own spectacular downfall. It all began the moment I retired from the United States Army. After 22 years as a combat engineer, dealing with everything from complex demolitions in hostile territory to building forward operating bases out of dust and desperation, I was done. Done with deployments, done with the bureaucracy, done with living out of a duffel bag. My wife, Sarah, and I wanted roots. We found them in a quiet, beautiful subdivision called Willow Creek Estates, a place that promised peace, community, and meticulously maintained green spaces. The HOA rules were thick enough to stop a bullet, but after a career built on regulations and standard operating procedures, I figured I could handle it. We bought a lovely 2-story house with a spacious backyard, the perfect canvas for the dream I'd been sketching on notepads for over a decade. A dedicated, state-of-the-art woodworking shop. It wasn't just a hobby, it was my therapy, the place where the chaos of the world could be smoothed away by the patient pass of a hand plane over a piece of rough-sawn oak. Before a single shovel of dirt was turned, I did my homework. I spent 3 months just on the plans, designing a 600-square-foot detached structure that was not only functional but aesthetically pleasing, designed to match the architecture of our main house down to the color of the trim. I read the HOA covenants cover to cover, memorizing the sections on outbuildings, setbacks, and construction noise. Then I moved on to the county. I personally walked my plans through the county planning and zoning department, getting to know the clerks by name. I got the building permit, the electrical permit, the plumbing permit for the small utility sink I plan to install. I engineered the foundation to be twice as strong as required and designed the electrical system with sub-panels and dedicated circuits that would make a master electrician weep with joy. I knew with the certainty of a man who has built bridges under fire that this structure was over-engineered, over-compliant, and safer than any other building in the entire subdivision, including the community clubhouse. The HOA approval was the final, and I assumed, easiest hurdle. I submitted my entire packet, the county-stamped blueprints, the permit approvals, the material lists, the color swatches, to the Architectural Review Committee, chaired by the one and only Karen Miller. I received a terse, one-line email approval 2 weeks later. The construction was my personal project. Every weekend, every evening, I was out there. I dug the footers myself, framed the walls with Sarah's help, and ran every wire. My neighbors were fantastic, often stopping by with cold drinks, curious and supportive of the project taking shape. All except one. Karen, whose house was 3 doors down and across the street, would often stand on her porch, arms crossed, watching me with an unnerving stillness. Her reign as HOA president was legendary, a tapestry of petty grievances and draconian enforcement. She'd measured the height of Mr. Henderson's prize-winning roses with a tape measure and fined him because they were 2 inches taller than the bylaws allowed. She'd sent a violation notice to the Garcia family because their son's portable basketball hoop was, in her words, aesthetically disruptive. She was a woman who derived her life's purpose from the control she exerted over others, and my workshop, a symbol of independence and craftsmanship just outside her direct control, seemed to offend her on a molecular level. My first direct interaction with her came when I was installing the siding. She marched across the street, clipboard in hand. The approved color was Harvest Beige, number 74B from the approved palette, she announced without so much as a hello. That looks like desert sand. I paused, paintbrush in hand. Good morning to you too, Karen. It is Harvest Beige. I can show you the can. She sniffed, unconvinced. It appears different in the afternoon light. I'll be monitoring it. She made a note on her clipboard and marched away. This was the game she played. Not direct accusation, but the constant, unnerving threat of one. The project was finally completed in early September. It was my masterpiece, soundproofed, climate-controlled, with a dust collection system that could suck a golf ball through a garden hose. It was clean, quiet, and from the street, looked like a charming little guest cottage. I spent a week moving in my tools, arranging my lumber, and then, on a beautiful Saturday morning, I turned on my lathe for the first time to shape a simple bowl from a block of cherry wood. The low hum of the motor was a sweet, satisfying sound, the culmination of a lifelong dream. That hum had been vibrating for no more than 10 minutes when my front doorbell rang. It was Karen, and she was not there to admire my handiwork. This was the prelude to the war, the first shot across the bow, and her opening salvo was the accusation that would set everything in motion. You are running a commercial business out of your home. That is a direct violation of Article 7, Section 4 of the Covenants, she declared, her voice echoing in my foyer. The accusation was so absurd it took me a moment to process. I was a retired soldier, living on my pension and just starting a new quiet life. The idea of running a business was laughable. I calmly explained that I was a hobbyist. She wasn't listening. Her eyes were narrowed, her mind already made up. I hear machinery. That is industrial noise. It was a prelude to the confrontation on my lawn, a testing of the waters. She was looking for a weakness, an angle of attack, and when simple bylaw violations failed to stick, she decided to escalate to the most serious charge she could conjure, a public safety hazard. That's what brought her to my lawn that day, jabbing her finger, her face flushed with the thrill of impending victory. She had found the perfect weapon, a threat that would surely bring me to my knees. The fire marshal. Little did she know, she wasn't just threatening to call my office. She was threatening to call me. After retiring from the Army, I hadn't been content to just sit around. I'd taken my engineering background, my obsession with safety protocols, and my desire to serve and enrolled in the fire academy. I'd spent the last year working for the county, rising quickly to the rank of assistant fire marshal, specializing in building codes, safety inspections, and arson investigation. My name was Mark Reynolds, and I was the fire marshal. The purple, blotchy rage that washed over Karen's face as I stood there, utterly unfazed by her ultimate threat, was a sight to behold. Her power, her entire sense of self, was built on the fear she could inspire with her clipboard and her encyclopedic knowledge of the HOA rulebook. When I didn't cower, didn't plead, didn't immediately offer to dismantle my life's dream board by board, her programming seemed to short-circuit. Did you hear me? She spat, her voice rising in pitch. The fire marshal. They don't mess around. They have the authority to condemn unsafe structures. This isn't like one of my little warnings about lawn maintenance. I let the silence hang in the air for a moment, enjoying the way her certainty began to curdle into confusion. I heard you, Karen, I said, my voice level and calm. You're going to call the County Fire Marshal's office and report my fully permitted, fully inspected, and fully approved workshop as a fire hazard. I intentionally used the words permitted, inspected, and approved like a series of hammer blows against her flimsy accusation. Her eyes narrowed. It's a sham. Whatever backroom deal you cut with the county, I'll expose it. All that wood, the chemicals, the wiring you probably did yourself, it's a death trap. I almost laughed. The wiring I did myself was inspected and signed off on by the county's head electrical inspector. A man so thorough he'd once written up a hospital for using the wrong gauge wire on a thermostat. Well, Karen, I said, taking a deliberate step towards her, off my porch and onto the lawn, reclaiming the ground she'd tried to conquer. You do what you feel you have to do. File the complaint, make it official, list every single concern you have, in detail. I encourage it. Her jaw went slack. This was not the reaction she was accustomed to. She expected groveling, not encouragement. She was a predator who had cornered her prey, only to find it was a much larger, calmer predator just waiting for her to make a foolish move. She sputtered, trying to regain her footing. Oh, I will, I will. I have a direct line to the department head. People listen to me. When your little shack is covered in yellow condemnation tape, don't come crying to me. With a final theatrical huff, she spun on her sensible shoed heel and marched back across the street, her entire body rigid with indignation. I watched her go, a cold, hard knot of resolve forming in my gut. This was no longer about a workshop. This was about a bully who had finally overplayed her hand. I went back inside where Sarah was standing by the window, having witnessed the whole exchange. Are you okay? She asked, her brow furrowed with concern. Sarah was a corporate lawyer, a woman who understood conflict but preferred it contained within conference rooms and legal briefs. Open hostility on our front lawn was not her style. I'm better than okay, I said, the plan already beginning to form in my mind. She just handed me the rope. Sarah looked confused. What are you going to do? I'm going to let her hang herself with it, I replied, heading not to my workshop but to my home office. The first step was documentation. In the Army, we had a saying, if it's not in writing, it didn't happen. I sat down and typed out a detailed, time-stamped summary of the entire conversation with Karen, including her exact threat. I saved it as a PDF and emailed a copy to myself and to Sarah, creating a digital paper trail. This wasn't just about winning a fight, it was about building a case. The next morning, I went to work at the fire station. My boss, Fire Chief Miller, was a gruff, no-nonsense man who had seen it all. I had a good relationship with him, built on mutual respect. I decided to get out in front of the situation. I walked into his office, closed the door, and laid it all out. Chief, I started, I need to give you a heads up on a potential conflict of interest situation involving my property. I explained about my retirement project, the HOA, and the president, Karen. I didn't editorialize, I just gave him the facts, culminating in her threat to file a formal complaint. Miller leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. He listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. And this workshop of yours, he said when I finished, is it up to code? Chief, I replied, looking him straight in the eye, it exceeds code in every single category. I have the signed-off permits and inspection reports to prove it. He nodded slowly. All right, Reynolds, here's how this is going to go. If and when her complaint comes in, I have to treat it as legitimate. I can't just dismiss it because it's your property. That would open the county up to liability. I'll have to assign an inspector to go out there. I understand, Chief, I said. It's the only way. But, he continued, a faint glimmer of something, amusement, respect, in his eyes. I will also make sure the responding marshal documents everything with extreme prejudice. And to avoid any appearance of impropriety, it won't be you. I'll assign Peterson. He's a stickler, but he's fair. And you will not be involved in the official process in any way. You'll be treated like any other citizen. Got it? Got it, Chief. Thank you. I left his office feeling a sense of grim satisfaction. The wheels were in motion. Karen thought she was setting a trap for me, but she was the one walking into a cage of her own making, a cage built of official procedures, documented evidence, and the letter of the law. The waiting was the hardest part. For 2 days, there was nothing but an unnerving silence from Karen's corner of the neighborhood. She didn't make her usual patrols, clipboard in hand. Her curtains remained drawn. It was the quiet before the storm, and I used the time to prepare. Every document related to the workshop's construction was pulled, organized, and placed in a 3-ring binder, tabbed and indexed like a legal exhibit. The blueprints, the county permits, the HOA approval email, the receipts for fire-rated drywall and insulation, the spec sheets for the electrical components, the service tags on my fire extinguishers, everything. Sarah, with her lawyer's eye for detail, went through it all, cross-referencing dates and signatures. "This is airtight, Mark," she said, tapping the thick binder. "It's more than airtight. It's a fortress." On the third day the email landed. It wasn't sent to me directly. It was an official notification from our department's administrative assistant, forwarded to a small distribution list that included Chief Miller, myself, and Marshal Peterson. Subject: formal fire safety complaint, 124 Willow Creek Lane, my address. Attached was a 3-page PDF, a scanned copy of Karen's formal complaint, written in a florid, accusatory script. It was a work of pure fiction. She alleged improper storage of vast quantities of flammable liquids, citing the single sealed 5-gallon can of Dextain I had on a metal shelf. She claimed the structure had unshielded, faulty wiring, creating an imminent electrocution and fire hazard. She described the deafening industrial noise as evidence of illegal commercial manufacturing. She even invented a lack of proper ventilation for toxic fumes, and, my personal favorite, an unpermitted wood-burning stove. I didn't even own a wood-burning stove. I read the list of fabricated dangers, and the anger I felt was cold and sharp. This wasn't a misguided complaint from a concerned citizen. This was a malicious, calculated lie designed to cause maximum damage. She had put her name, her signature, on an official document that was demonstrably false, and she had sent it to my employer. The game was on. Chief Miller called me into his office the moment I arrived at the station. The forwarded email was open on his monitor. He didn't look angry. He looked weary, like a man who'd seen this particular brand of human pettiness one too many times. Marshal Peterson was already there, a tall, lanky man in his late 40s with a perpetually serious expression. He nodded at me, a silent acknowledgement of the awkwardness of the situation. "Reynolds," Miller began, getting straight to the point, "the complaint has been officially filed. As we discussed, Peterson will be the lead on this. He's going to conduct a full, by-the-book inspection of your property this afternoon at 1400 hours. You will be present as the homeowner, but you will not act in any official capacity. You will answer his questions and provide any documentation he requests. Is that clear?" "Crystal clear, Chief," I said. Peterson spoke for the first time, his voice a low baritone. "Mark, I'm sorry we're in this position. I'm just going to follow the checklist. The complaint is detailed." He chose the word carefully, the professional term for completely unhinged. "I appreciate you handling it, Peterson," I said. "Just call it like you see it." That was all I needed, an honest, impartial inspection. Karen's lies were so specific, so brazen, that they would be incredibly easy to disprove with simple, physical evidence. Her imagination was about to collide with a wall of hard, verifiable reality. I went home at lunch to prep. Sarah had already been busy. She had taken my binder of documents and arranged them on the large workbench in the center of my shop. It looked like a command center preparing for a major audit. Each section of Karen's complaint was laid out with the corresponding evidence to refute it. For the vast quantities of flammable liquids, she had placed the single, sealed can of stain next to the official fire code regulations on residential storage limits, which I was nowhere near exceeding. For the faulty wiring, she had the signed electrical inspection certificate from the county, the blueprints showing the dedicated circuits and GFCI protection, and even photos I had taken of the wiring before the drywall went up. For the lack of ventilation, she had the spec sheet for my industrial-grade dust collection system and the 2 large operational windows and exhaust fan. It was a museum of Karen's falsehoods, each one with its own exhibit of truth. At exactly 2 p.m., a white county vehicle pulled up to the curb. Marshal Peterson stepped out, wearing his official uniform, carrying a clipboard and a camera. I met him at the gate to my backyard. "Afternoon, Mark," he said, his tone professional, but with an undercurrent of sympathy. "Let's get this over with." I nodded. "The workshop is this way. My wife, Sarah, is inside. She's a lawyer, so she helped me organize the paperwork you might need." Peterson raised an eyebrow slightly, a silent acknowledgement that the stakes had been raised. We entered the workshop. The air was clean, smelling faintly of sawdust and fresh-cut pine. The lights were bright, the floor was swept, and every tool was in its proper place. Sarah stood by the workbench, a polite but firm presence. "Marshal Peterson," I said. "This is my wife, Sarah." "Sarah, Marshal Peterson." They exchanged nods. "All right," Peterson said, looking at Karen's complaint on his clipboard. "Let's start with the first item. Alleged improper storage of flammable liquids." I pointed to the metal safety cabinet. "All my finishes and solvents are in there, as per code. The only thing not in the cabinet is that can of deck stain, which is water-based, sealed, and well below the allowable residential quantity." Peterson walked over, examined the can, made a note on his clipboard, and took a photo. "Noted." He moved to the next item. Allegation of faulty unshielded wiring. Sarah tapped the binder. "Here is the final, signed electrical permit from the county inspector, Mr. Davies. Here are the plans showing all wiring is running conduit, with GFCI outlets at every station. And these," she said, sliding a series of glossy photos across the table, "are time-stamped pictures of the wiring and junction boxes taken before the insulation and drywall were installed." Peterson spent several minutes reviewing the documents and comparing them to the visible outlets and conduit runs on the walls. He walked over to the main panel and the sub-panel, opening them to inspect the breakers and wiring. He was thorough, checking everything. "Wiring appears to be professionally installed and compliant with the National Electrical Code," he murmured, making another note and taking more photos. We continued like this for nearly an hour, a methodical, almost surgical dismantling of Karen's fantasy. Claim of illegal commercial activity based on industrial noise. I turned on the lathe. It emitted a low, unobtrusive hum. Then I turned on the dust collector. The sound was louder, but no more so than a household vacuum cleaner. "The shop is fully insulated with sound-dampening insulation, Marshal. I'd be happy to have you stand on the property line to verify the decibel level, but I can assure you it's well within residential limits." Peterson just nodded, making another note. The final and most absurd allegation was the unpermitted wood-burning stove. Peterson scanned the room, his eyes sweeping over every corner. He looked at me, a flicker of dry humor in his gaze. "Mr. Rennell," he said with formal gravity, "can you please indicate the location of the wood-burning stove listed in the complaint?" "I'm afraid I can't, Marshal," I replied, my own voice deadpan. "To my knowledge, one has never been installed. You can see there is no chimney, no flue, and no heat shielding on any wall that would indicate the presence of such a device, past or present." Peterson slowly lowered his clipboard. He took one last long look around the workshop, at the organized tools, the clean floor, the mountain of validating paperwork on the bench. He looked at me, then at Sarah. He shook his head slightly, a gesture of disbelief at the waste of his time. "I think I have everything I need," he said. He spent another 10 minutes outside, measuring the building's distance from the property lines, confirming the setbacks matched the approved plans. Finally, he came back to me, his official inspection complete. "Mark," he said, his voice dropping the formal tone, "this place isn't just compliant. It's a fortress. It's better built and safer than my own damn house. You'll have my official report by tomorrow morning." He paused, then looked me in the eye. "And I will be sure to note in my report that the complaint filed appears to be, in my professional opinion, entirely without merit, frivolous, and potentially filed with malicious intent." That was it. That was the phrase, the key that would unlock the next stage of my plan. Karen hadn't just filed a complaint. She had committed an act of malicious harassment, and now I had an official, impartial government agent who was about to put it in writing. The hunter had just walked, eyes wide open, into the snare. The following morning, exactly as promised, an email from Peterson arrived in my inbox, with Chief Miller CC'd. Attached was the official inspection report, a crisp 5-page PDF. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic demolition. For each of Karen's hysterical allegations, Peterson had written a calm, factual rebuttal, citing the specific code, the physical evidence, and the documentation I had provided. The report concluded with the exact language he had promised. Based on a thorough on-site inspection and review of all relevant permits and documentation, this office finds no evidence to support any of the claims made in the complaint filed by Ms. Karen Miller. The structure at 124 Willow Creek Lane is found to be in full compliance with all county and state fire and building codes. Furthermore, the number and nature of the unsubstantiated claims lead this office to conclude that the complaint was frivolous and likely filed with malicious intent. I read the final sentence 3 times, savoring it like a fine wine. It was more than a vindication, it was a weapon. I saved the document to a secure folder on my computer, labeled simply Project Nightingale, a nod to the old military term for a counterintelligence operation. My war with Karen was moving into a new phase. It was no longer about defense. Now it was time to go on the offensive. That evening, I drove to the home of my old friend, Dave Sterling. Dave and I had served together in the Army, he in the JAG Corps, the military's legal arm. Now he was a partner at a downtown law firm, a shark in a tailored suit who specialized in civil litigation. I found him in his study, a room paneled in dark mahogany that smelled of old books and leather. I handed him a printed copy of Peterson's report without a word. He put on his reading glasses and began to read. As he went, a slow grin spread across his face. "Oh, she did not," he chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "She put it in writing. She accused a fire marshal of fire code violations to the fire marshal's own department, and it was all a lie." "Every word," I confirmed. "She's been terrorizing the neighborhood for years. This time, she picked the wrong target. I want to know what my options are." Dave took off his glasses and tossed the report onto his desk. "Options? Mark, you have a buffet of options. This isn't just an HOA squabble anymore. She used a government agency to harass you. That report, with that specific language from Peterson, is gold." He stood up and began to pace, the lawyer in him coming alive. "First, we look at the HOA's own governing documents. I'll bet you a bottle of 20-year-old scotch there's a clause in there about frivolous actions and legal fees. If a homeowner initiates an action in bad faith that costs the association or another homeowner money, they are personally liable for the costs." My mind immediately went to the thick binder of HOA covenants sitting on my bookshelf. "I think I remember seeing something like that," I said. "Good," Dave said. "We're going to use that. But we're not just going after her for the cost of my time or the administrative cost of the inspection. We're going to dig deeper. This woman feels untouchable. We need to dismantle the foundation of her power." He stopped pacing and looked at me. "Her power comes from the HOA. So we're going to turn the HOA against her." "You said she's been doing this for years? Harassing other residents?" "Constantly," I confirmed. "Fining people for the color of their welcome mats, the height of their kids' toys, you name it." "Then your next step is to become a journalist," Dave instructed. "Go talk to these people, quietly, get their stories. Get copies of the violation notices, the fines they paid. Get them to write it down, to sign an affidavit. We're not just building a case for Mark Reynolds, we're building a case for the entire community. We need to establish a pattern of abuse. We need to show that her actions against you weren't an isolated incident, but the latest in a long history of targeted harassment and selective enforcement." The plan was brilliant in its simplicity. Karen ruled through fear and isolation, making each targeted homeowner feel like they were the only one. By uniting them, by showing them they weren't alone, we could create a force she couldn't control. "What's the end game?" I asked. "We hit her from 3 directions," Dave explained, holding up his fingers. 1, a formal demand for reimbursement sent to her and the entire HOA board, citing the malicious intent finding and the bylaws. We demand she personally pay back the county for the inspection and cover all our legal fees. 2, we use the evidence of her pattern of abuse to petition the board for her immediate removal as president for breach of her fiduciary duty to the community. And 3, he paused for a dramatic effect, we petition for a full independent forensic audit of the HOA's financials for the entire duration of her presidency. A woman this drunk on power rarely keeps her hands clean. If she's abusing her authority, there's a good chance she's abusing the checkbook too. It was a 3-pronged attack designed not just to win, but to annihilate her power base. The beauty of it was that we would be using the HOA's own rules and procedures as our primary weapon. We weren't breaking any laws, we were enforcing them. I left Dave's house that night with a clear mission. The next day I started my investigation. I began with the Garcias, the young family 3 houses down who had been cited for their son's basketball hoop. I found Mr. Garcia in his driveway, washing his car. I approached him cautiously, not wanting to seem like I was causing trouble. "Hey, Carlos," I started. "Got a minute? I'm Mark from down the street. I wanted to ask you about your experience with the HOA." His friendly demeanor immediately soured. "You mean with Karen," he said, his voice low. "Yeah, she got you for the basketball hoop, right?" He sighed, putting down his sponge. "Yeah, fined us $200. Said it was visually intrusive. My son was crushed. We just paid it to make her go away." I nodded sympathetically. "I understand. She recently came after me for my workshop, filed a big complaint with the county." I showed him a copy of Peterson's report on my phone. As he read the malicious intent part, his eyes widened. "No way," he whispered. "She's finally getting called on it." "I'm trying to build a case," I explained, "to show this is a pattern. I was wondering if you'd be willing to share your story, maybe even sign a statement about what happened with the hoop." A look of resolve hardened his features. "You're damn right I will," he said. "What do you need?" That was the first domino, the first crack in Karen's wall of fear. I had found my first ally. My quiet campaign to gather intelligence began to pick up momentum with surprising speed. Carlos Garcia was not only willing to provide a sworn statement, but he also became an invaluable source of information. He had lived in Willow Creek Estates for 5 years and had seen Karen's reign of terror from the beginning. "You need to talk to old Mr. Henderson at the end of the cul-de-sac," Carlos told me, his voice a conspiratorial whisper as we stood in his garage. "She made him rip out a rose garden his late wife planted. Said the specific variety of rose wasn't on the HOA's pre-approved list. Broke the old man's heart. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. It wasn't about maintaining standards. It was about inflicting pain." I found Mr. Henderson tending to a small, meticulously kept patch of annuals in his front yard, the spot where the roses used to be now barren save for a layer of mulch. He was a frail man in his late 80s with kind eyes that held a deep sadness. When I introduced myself and gently broached the subject of the HOA, he was hesitant at first, conditioned by years of keeping his head down. But when I told him about my own fight, about the false complaint and the official report, a spark of defiance flickered in his eyes. "She told me they were a blight," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "My Eleanor planted those roses the week we moved in here, 30 years ago. They were a hybrid tea rose she'd cultivated herself. After she passed, they were all I had left of her in the garden." He invited me inside and showed me the violation letters, the threats of liens on his property all over a dozen rose bushes. He had carefully preserved every piece of paper in a shoebox. It was a chronicle of bureaucratic cruelty. I spent an hour with him, just listening, as he recounted the story. By the end, he agreed to write it all down. "It's too late for my roses," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But it's not too late to stop her from doing this to someone else." I left his house with copies of his documents and a profound sense of righteous anger. Karen hadn't just been a bully. She was a ghoul, preying on the vulnerable. Over the next 2 weeks, with the help of Carlos and a few other quiet converts, I uncovered a dozen similar stories. There was the young couple fined because their garbage cans were visible from the street for an hour after the designated time. The family forced to repaint their front door because the shade of blue was a single tick-off on the approved color chart. A retired teacher who was ordered to remove a small, tasteful welcome sign because it wasn't on the list of approved seasonal decor. In every case, the pattern was the same. A minor, often subjective infraction met with an aggressive, disproportionate response. Karen never called, never discussed. She only sent formal, intimidating letters filled with legal-sounding jargon, threatening fines, liens, and legal action. She was using paperwork as a weapon to isolate and terrify residents into compliance. While I gathered these affidavits, Dave was doing his own digging. He'd filed a public records request for all HOA filings with the state, including their annual budgets and board meeting minutes. "The official minutes are useless," he told me over the phone one night. "They're sanitized. Old business discussed, new business approved. No details, but the budgets are interesting." "What did you find?" I asked, spreading my collection of affidavits across my dining room table. "Her administrative budget is generous," Dave said wryly. "There are line items for community outreach, board supplies, and professional consulting that have tripled in the last 3 years, ever since she became president. But there are no corresponding receipts or invoices filed with the reports. It's all just lump sums, it's sloppy, it's arrogant. This was the financial angle we were looking for, the potential misappropriation of funds. It was the one thing that would turn the entire community and, more importantly, the other board members against her. The other board members were mostly compliant bystanders, people who had been roped into service and were happy to let Karen run the show as long as they didn't have to do any real work. But the threat of being held liable for financial malfeasance would wake them from their slumber. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. One of the other board members, the treasurer, a nervous-looking accountant named George, reached out to me through Carlos. He was scared. He had seen the rising administrative costs, but had been too intimidated by Karen to question them. He had heard whispers of my investigation and wanted to know what was happening. I met him at a coffee shop miles away from our neighborhood. He was visibly shaking. "She told me they were for legal retainers and printing costs for the newsletters," he stammered, stirring his untouched latte. "But the amounts, they seemed high. Every time I asked for an itemized breakdown, she would get defensive, accuse me of not trusting her leadership." I didn't need to press him. He was ready to talk. He explained how Karen controlled the HOA's debit card and checkbook exclusively. She would submit lump sum expense reports at the end of each quarter, which the board would rubber stamp. George, as treasurer, should have been auditing them, but he'd been cowed into simply filing them away. "George," I said calmly, "you have a fiduciary duty to the members of this association. If funds have been misappropriated under your watch, you could be held liable right alongside her." His face went pale. "What do I do?" "You do the right thing," I said, sliding a folder across the table. "This is a formal petition, signed by myself and 15 other homeowners. It calls for a special meeting of the board to address a grievance against the president, and it includes a motion for a full, independent forensic audit of the HOA's finances for the last 3 years. According to the bylaws, a petition with this many signatures requires the board to call a meeting within 30 days. George stared at the folder as if it were a venomous snake. "She'll kill me," he whispered. "She'll be too busy defending herself to worry about you," I countered. "The other board members are going to get a copy of this as well. You have a choice, George. You can go down with her ship, or you can be the one who helps write the course. All you have to do is second the motion for the audit when it's brought to the floor." He sat there for a long time, the folder sitting between us. Finally, with a trembling hand, he picked it up. "Okay," he said, his voice barely audible. "Okay, I'll do it." The trap was now fully set. We had the public support, the legal justification, and an inside man. The next HOA meeting was going to be a show. The day we sent the packet was a beautiful, sunny Tuesday. Dave and I had assembled everything with military precision. The cover letter was a formal demand addressed to Karen Miller personally, as well as to the HOA Board of Directors collectively. It detailed her campaign of harassment against me, citing the official fire marshal's report as Exhibit A. It quoted the bylaw regarding actions taken in bad faith, and formally demanded she personally reimburse the county for the cost of the frivolous inspection, a figure we had obtained from the chief's office, and pay for Dave's legal fees, with an itemized bill attached. The letter went on to state that her actions were part of a larger, documented pattern of abuse against numerous residents, breaching her fiduciary duty of care to the community. Finally, it formally submitted the petition, signed by 16 homeowners, demanding a special meeting and a vote on a full, independent forensic audit. We didn't just mail it. Dave hired a process server to deliver one packet directly to Karen's front door. The other 4 packets were sent via certified mail, return receipt requested, to the other 4 board members, including George the treasurer. This was a critical step. No one could claim they hadn't received it. The certified mail receipts would be our proof. We were forcing them to take a side. They could either circle the wagons around Karen, making themselves complicit in her actions and legally liable for the potential financial fallout, or they could save themselves by throwing her to the wolves. For a week, the neighborhood was eerily quiet, but the silence was different this time. It wasn't the silence of fear, it was the silence of anticipation. You could feel the tension in the air. People who used to just give a polite wave now stopped to talk, their eyes asking the question, is it happening? The official notice for the special meeting was posted on the community bulletin board 2 weeks later, as required by the bylaws. It was a sterile typed announcement, but to those of us who knew what was coming, it was a declaration of war. The meeting was to be held in the community clubhouse, a sterile, beige room that usually hosted yoga classes and children's birthday parties. On the night of the meeting, the room was packed. Standing room only. I had never seen more than 10 people at an HOA meeting before. Tonight, there were at least 100. The Garcias were there. Mr. Henderson was there, sitting in the front row, looking more resolute than I had ever seen him. George the treasurer was sitting at the board members' table, sweating profusely and avoiding eye contact with everyone. Karen sat at the head of the table, flanked by the other two board members, a pair of retirees who looked deeply uncomfortable. Karen, however, was in her element. She surveyed the packed room not with apprehension, but with a look of smug authority, as if this massive turnout was a testament to her importance. She opened the meeting with her usual officious tone, banging a small gavel on the table. Welcome to this special meeting of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. Let's dispense with the reading of the previous minutes and move directly to the business at hand. She picked up our letter, holding it between two fingers as if it were a piece of trash. We are here because Mr. Mark Reynolds of 124 Willow Creek Lane has seen fit to lodge a series of baseless and insulting complaints against the board, and myself specifically. She was trying to frame it as an attack on the entire board, a classic tactic to consolidate power. It wasn't going to work. Before she could continue her narrative, I stood up. Point of order, Madam President, I said, my voice calm, but loud enough to fill the room. All eyes turned to me. Karen glared. You are out of order, Mr. Reynolds. This is not the open forum portion of the meeting. According to Robert's Rules of Order, which our bylaws state we must follow, a point of order can be raised at any time, I countered, having done my homework. My point is that you are mischaracterizing the nature of the grievance. The grievance, as stated in the letter, is against you, Karen Miller, for a documented pattern of malicious harassment and potential breach of fiduciary duty. It is not against the board as a whole, unless they choose to make it so by defending your actions. A murmur went through the crowd. George the treasurer sank lower in his chair. Karen's face flushed a deep, angry red. Your point is noted and dismissed, she snapped. Now, as I was saying, I believe the petition requires that the grievance be read aloud to the members present. Dave, who was standing next to me, interjected smoothly. He wasn't a resident, but I had designated him as my legal representative, a right afforded in the bylaws. He held up a copy of the covenants. Article 9, Section 3. Any formal petition signed by 10% or more of the membership must be read in its entirety at the start of the special meeting called to address it. Karen's jaw tightened. She was trapped by the very rules she so loved to wield against others. She had no choice. With a look of pure hatred directed at me, she began to read the letter aloud. Her voice dripped with sarcasm as she read the accusations, but the words themselves held the power. When she got to the part about the fire marshal's report finding her complaint frivolous and with malicious intent, a collective gasp went through the room. She stumbled over the words, the reality of them hitting the public air for the first time. She then had to read the demand that she personally pay the fines and fees. The audience was silent, hanging on every word. Finally, she read the core demand, the motion for a full, independent forensic audit. When she finished, a heavy silence fell over the room. She threw the letter down on the table. A ridiculous, slanderous fantasy, she declared. Now I will entertain a motion to dismiss this absurd petition in its entirety. One of her cronies on the board immediately said, So moved. Second? Karen asked, looking expectantly at the other members. But before anyone else could speak, I raised my hand. Before a vote is called, I would like to exercise my right as a member to speak to the issue, as is my right during a special meeting. Karen looked like she was about to explode, but the eyes of 100 residents were on her. She was trapped. Fine, she hissed. You have 3 minutes. I didn't need 3 minutes. I walked to the front of the room, holding a single piece of paper. It was the fire marshal's report. My name is Mark Reynolds. For 22 years, I was a combat engineer in the U.S. Army. I build things, and I build them to last. When I built my workshop, I followed every rule, every code to the letter. But that wasn't good enough for Miss Miller. She decided, without any evidence, that my property was a danger. She filed a false report, a report full of lies with a government agency. She didn't do it to protect the community. She did it to harass me. I held up the report. This is the official finding from the County Fire Marshal's office. It not only exonerates me completely, it concludes that Ms. Miller acted with malicious intent. This wasn't a mistake. It was an abuse of power. I then turned to the crowd. And I am not the only one. Who else here has been a target? Who else has received a threatening letter over something as trivial as the color of their flowers or a child's toy? Mr. Henderson stood up, his voice shaking but clear. She made me tear out my wife's roses. Carlos Garcia stood up. She fined me hundreds of dollars for a basketball hoop. A woman in the back stood up. She threatened to sue me over a welcome mat. One by one, people began to stand, a silent, powerful testament to her reign of terror. Karen's face went from red to a pasty white. Her fortress was crumbling around her. I turned back to the board. The motion on the floor should not be to dismiss this petition. The motion on the floor should be to approve the independent audit to protect the homeowners of this community from a president who has clearly violated her duties. I yield the floor. All eyes went to the board table. The member who had moved to dismiss the petition now looked terrified. Karen stared straight ahead, her world collapsing in public. Then a quiet voice spoke up. It was George, the treasurer. He stood up, his hands trembling, but his voice steady. I would like to make a substitute motion, he said, looking not at Karen, but at the assembled homeowners. I move that the board immediately authorize a full independent forensic audit of all HOA financial accounts for the past 3 years, to be conducted by an outside firm with no connection to the board or any member thereof. A stunned silence followed by an eruption of applause. Second, yelled Carlos Garcia from the crowd. Karen slammed her gavel down. This is out of order. There is already a motion on the floor. A substitute motion takes precedence over the primary motion, Madam President. Dave's voice cut through the noise, cool and authoritative. We must vote on the substitute motion first. Karen was cornered, outmaneuvered by the very procedural rules she loved. All in favor of the audit? The board secretary asked, her voice wavering. A forest of hands went up, nearly every person in the room. All opposed? The secretary looked at Karen. Only Karen's hand and that of her one remaining crony went up. The motion carries, the secretary announced, a note of disbelief in her voice. Karen Miller just sat there, her face a mask of stone-cold fury. In one public meeting, her power had been stripped, her authority shattered, and her secrets targeted for exposure. The audit was coming. The aftermath of the meeting was like a dam breaking. The fear that had held Willow Creek Estates in a chokehold for years simply evaporated, replaced by a flood of shared stories and a palpable sense of relief. People lingered in the clubhouse parking lot for nearly an hour, talking in excited groups, exchanging phone numbers, and shaking my hand. Mr. Henderson gripped my arm, his eyes wet with tears. Thank you, he said simply. You gave us our voice back. But the real battle, the one that would deliver the finishing blow, was just beginning. The motion for the audit had passed, but we had to ensure it was truly independent. Dave, acting on behalf of our newly formed Concerned Homeowners Group, immediately sent a letter to the board insisting that the selection of the auditing firm be done transparently, with a third-party recommendation from a neutral source. George, now emboldened by the public support, championed the cause from within the board, and they agreed to hire a highly respected forensic accounting firm from the city. Karen, meanwhile, had gone to ground. Her curtains were drawn, her car didn't leave her driveway, and she was conspicuously absent from her usual patrol routes. She had been publicly humiliated and stripped of her primary tool of control. Her only remaining move was to try and obstruct the audit, but the momentum was against her. The other board members, smelling blood in the water and terrified of their own liability, were now cooperating fully. They granted the auditors full access to the HOA's bank records, expense reports, and storage units where old files were kept. The lead auditor, a woman with piercing blue eyes and a reputation for being relentless, told me, "If there's a single dollar out of place, we will find it." They found more than a dollar. 2 weeks into the audit, I got a call from Dave. "You are not going to believe this," he said, and I could hear the glee in his voice. "The auditors found the mother lode. It's worse and more pathetic than we ever imagined." He explained that Karen hadn't just been padding the budget. She had been using the HOA debit card as her personal slush fund. The vague community outreach expenses were, in fact, a series of lavish dinners at expensive restaurants, often with only one or two guests. Board supplies included charges from a high-end spa for manicures and massages and a subscription to a wine of the month club. The most flagrant discovery was under the professional consulting line item. The auditors found regular, significant payments made to a landscaping company called Miller Lawn and Garden. A quick search of state business records revealed the owner of the company was none other than Karen's cousin. The firm had been charging the HOA nearly double the market rate for basic services like mowing the common areas and trimming bushes. She had been embezzling funds and funneling them directly to her own family. The total amount of misappropriated funds was estimated to be over $40,000. It was a staggering betrayal of trust. The audit report was a bombshell. When it was presented to the board in a closed-door session, the effect was immediate. Faced with irrefutable evidence of embezzlement and fraud, the board had no choice. They voted unanimously to remove Karen Miller as president and as a board member, effective immediately. They also voted to turn the entire audit report and all supporting evidence over to the county district attorney's office for criminal investigation. But my plan didn't end with just her removal from power. Now it was time for the personal consequences. Armed with the audit report and the mountain of affidavits from other residents, Dave filed a comprehensive civil lawsuit. It was filed not against the HOA, but against Karen Miller personally. The suit had multiple counts: defamation for the lies she told in her report to the fire department, harassment for the documented pattern of abuse against me and other residents, and most importantly, breach of fiduciary duty for her gross mismanagement and embezzlement of HOA funds. We sought not only punitive damages but also restitution for every homeowner who had been unjustly fined. We included the $200 for the Garcia's basketball hoop and a symbolic amount for the destruction of Mr. Henderson's rose garden. The lawsuit was the final, crushing blow. A week after the DA's office confirmed they were opening a criminal case, a process server, the same one who had delivered our initial demand letter, walked up to Karen's front door and served her with the civil suit. A neighbor later told me the man had to wait for several minutes after ringing the bell, and when Karen finally opened the door, her face, once so full of arrogant certainty, was pale, drawn, and utterly defeated. The sight of the legal papers in her hand seemed to make her shrink, the last vestiges of her self-importance draining away. The legal process is slow, but its outcome was inevitable. Faced with a mountain of evidence in the criminal case, Karen's lawyer advised her to take a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to a felony charge of theft by deception. She managed to avoid jail time, but the sentence was devastating in its own way. She was given 5 years of probation, ordered to pay full restitution of the $40,000 to the HOA, and was permanently barred from ever serving on any board or in any position of financial trust again. The civil suit was even more punishing. The judge, after reviewing the evidence, granted our motion for a summary judgment in our favor. He awarded damages to me and every other resident named in the suit, and in a particularly satisfying turn of the screw, he ordered Karen to personally pay all of our legal fees, a sum that had grown considerably. The final judgment against her totaled over $100,000. The financial ruin was complete. Within a month, a for sale sign appeared on her lawn. The house, her castle from which she had ruled her petty kingdom, had to be sold to cover the restitution, the civil judgments, and her own legal bills. The woman who had threatened to fine me into oblivion had been, in a very real sense, fined into oblivion herself. Her downfall was total, a direct result of her own hubris. She had picked a fight with the one person who not only had the skills to stand up to her, but the discipline to do it by the book, turning her own weapons of bureaucracy and regulation against her. The day the moving truck pulled up in front of Karen's house was a strangely quiet one in Willow Creek Estates. There was no celebration, no cheering, just a collective, unspoken sense of an ending. I watched from my living room window as a team of movers loaded her life into a truck. I saw her for the last time as she got into the passenger seat of a modest sedan driven by a relative. She looked smaller, diminished. The arrogant, powerful woman who had stood on my lawn and threatened to ruin me was gone, replaced by a ghost. She never once looked back at the house or the neighborhood she had tried so hard to control. The truck pulled away, turned the corner, and she was gone. Her departure left a power vacuum, but it was filled almost immediately with something new: hope. An emergency election was held to form a new HOA board. Mr. Henderson, to his own surprise, was nominated for president. At first he refused, saying he was too old, but a delegation of neighbors, including Carlos Garcia and myself, went to his house to convince him. "We don't need a ruler, Mr. Henderson," Carlos told him. "We need a gardener, someone who will help things grow instead of tearing them down." He tearfully accepted and was elected unanimously. The first action of the new board was to declare a full amnesty on all outstanding fines levied under Karen's regime. Their second was to undertake a complete review of the covenants. The rule about pre-approved plant varieties was the first to go. Struck from the books in honor of Mr. Henderson's late wife, Eleanor, the new board operated on a principle of communication and common sense, not intimidation and rigid dogma. Violation notices were replaced with friendly phone calls. The focus shifted from punishment to community building. A few months later, on a perfect Saturday in early summer, the new HOA sponsored a neighborhood-wide barbecue. The location they chose was the large common green space directly across from my house. And the centerpiece of the event, positioned right at the edge of the green, was my workshop. The doors were thrown wide open. I had spent the week crafting dozens of small, simple wooden toys, spinning tops, cars, and animals, and they were piled high in a basket for the neighborhood kids. People I barely knew came up to me, shaking my hand, thanking me not just for what I did, but for how I did it. They saw that I hadn't stooped to her level. I hadn't used threats or intimidation. I had used truth, procedure, and the law. I had trusted the system, even when it was being used against me. And in the end, the system had worked. Sarah and I stood on our porch, watching the scene unfold. Kids were running through sprinklers. Their parents were laughing and sharing food at picnic tables, and the sound of music and conversation filled the air. Mr. Henderson, looking 10 years younger, was manning the grill, a spatula in his hand instead of a violation notice. He caught my eye and gave me a broad, happy wave. I looked over at my workshop. The building that had been the catalyst for so much conflict now stood as a symbol of our victory. It was a testament to the idea that you could build something good and right, and that if you built it on a solid foundation of integrity, it could withstand any storm. Later that afternoon, I was back in my sanctuary, the scent of cedar filling the air. I had a new piece of reclaimed lumber on the workbench, a massive beam of old-growth Douglas fir I had salvaged from a demolished warehouse. It was dense, heavy, and full of character, marked with the scars and imperfections of a long and useful life. As I ran my hand over its rough surface, I thought about the nature of strength. Karen had believed strength was about power, control, and the ability to bend others to her will. She had built her empire on a foundation of fear, and it had crumbled at the first real challenge. True strength, I realized, was something else entirely. It was the quiet discipline to do a job right, down to the smallest detail. It was the patience to gather facts, to build a case, to trust the process. It was the courage to stand up not just for yourself, but for the quiet, the vulnerable, and the intimidated. It was the strength of a community, a group of individuals who, once united, were far more powerful than any single tyrant. The low hum of the planer filled the workshop as I began to smooth the first face of the old beam, shaving away the rough exterior to reveal the clean, strong grain beneath. It was a slow, methodical process requiring patience and a steady hand. It was justice in woodworking form. Outside, the sounds of the barbecue continued, a happy, vibrant score for this new chapter in our community's life. I had my peace, I had my sanctuary, and I had my neighborhood back. And I had learned a valuable lesson. When a bully threatens to burn down your house, sometimes the best response is not to fight fire with fire, but to hand them a copy of the fire code and let them incinerate themselves. The foundation of justice, like the foundation of my workshop, was solid, and it was here to stay.